All right, welcome to our first session with multiple speakers. And because we have multiple speakers who are all supposed to speak for very short time periods, it'd be great to start not as late as we've already started. But my name is Ryan White. I already introduced myself. Kim Arkand is my co-host for this session. She's also the first presenter. The only announcement I want to make before Kim starts is, in order to keep things moving, we're going to ask that you ask all questions via Slack. Even if you're in the room, for the individual presenters, ask your question via Slack. If you're on Zoom, you can ask it on Zoom. It'll be cut and pasted into Slack, or you can ask it on Slack, either the general channel or the 2018 workshop channel. That way, we'll sort of moderate the questions after each speaker, and then we'll hopefully have enough time for a real discussion at the end of the session. So.
And do it in the hashtag 2018 workshop channel. Okay, yes, that actually, Robert and my OCD agree on this. Please put that in the 2018 workshop hashtag so that we're collecting everything there. And now.
Go. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Arkand. I'm going to talk about the Aesthetics in Astronomy Research Project, a project we've been working at Chandra for, well, since about 2007 or so. Just a few highlights of some of the things we found. The Aesthetics in Astronomy project essentially looks at expert to non-expert differences on how people react and comprehend astronomical images. So some of the things we've looked at is how experts and non-experts respond to images such as this, which is the bullet cluster. And typically the astronomer or the expert type works from the astrophysics to the aesthetics, whereas the non-expert does the reverse, right? So they work from the aesthetics to the astrophysics. Not really a surprise, but it's good to have that sort of codified. The fact that images are colored in general or at all is actually really not well understood. There is like this idea that subsists that these are giant space selfies and that no processing is ever done. When that is found out on the non-expert spectrum, there can be a lack of trust. However, understanding what the issue is and being able to address it by providing transparency and discussion as to how you're making choices and what you're doing to process the images can help fix that issue of trust. Color itself is really important. It's one of the biggest questions that people have. Color is very sort of cultural, so the colors that you select can have different meanings to different peoples. Scale is the absolute biggest question that we get across all of our studies. We've done perhaps 8 or 9 studies, I'd say by now, and scale is one of the big topics. So being able to talk about scale, super important. Art. Why do I have this picture? I love this picture. People who are on the sort of the non-expert part of the spectrum actually really want to understand what it is that the scientist or the image processor is seeing when they create their images. So like you would go to a museum and have questions specifically, you might want to know what the curator or the art historian is trying to see in this picture, similarly in astrophysics. Additionally, the idea of context in storytelling matters. So I might not understand what's useful to learn about this picture. So being able to provide that context for your users is really important. And being able to talk about your context and your storytelling using metaphor and analogy has also shown to be incredibly effective with the non-experts. So that was my introduction. I've already used half of my time. So this is, I'm in trouble. This is our most recent study that we did was on Cassiopeia A supernova remnant. It was a micro study that we used just to look at all the different ways that we processed Cassiopeia A since Chandra launched back in 1999. Cass A is kind of the big image for Chandra. It was our first light. So we've processed this up, down, and sideways. Over 2 million seconds of information, lots of versions. From a still image like this to a more scientific image, we provided different versions of the images, both in 2D and 3-dimensional forms, and also over time for users to be randomized to be able to look through and then respond to questions both on aesthetic appeal, enjoyment, and also comprehension and the desire to learn more. We provided examples like this in the dreaded rainbow color map just to see if they were really popular or if we could perhaps sort of axe them forever. We also provided versions that looked rather raw, that kind of get this idea of the science in progress. And we also provided versions in 3 dimensions, both in still form, but also in movie form, both short and long. So we provided all of these versions, and we had some really interesting results. First, that images that look familiar, that look like what the public thinks an image should look like of space, were actually the most popular, which is not perhaps a surprise. They also had most as far as learning gains and the desire to learn more. However, I should add a big caveat that that does not exclude the less desirable looking images, those images can be useful when they're presented with the more recognizable image and when they're also explained very well. So we also had, just another caveat of this is that a lot of the people that came to this study, we had about 2,000 participants, were selected or volunteered rather from the Chandra, from the Chandra website, social media, and also from the Astronomy Picture of the Day. So our results were highly skewed towards a more educated, more science experts, and also more male population and older population as well. So please keep that in mind. Essentially, there were also some gender differences, which I won't have time to get into, but essentially for the 6 still images that we presented, this was indeed the most popular across all boards of appeal and learning and wanting to learn more. This was actually the second, which I was very surprised at. The rainbow color map image was nowhere to be found, thankfully. When it came to wanting to learn more, this was actually number 3. So this wasn't that far behind. When it came time for movies, the preference was to shorter videos, also not a surprise, but I'm talking 10 seconds short. That was actually the preference. I will say, however, that the 50-second and 35-second versions were also relatively popular and had pretty good comprehension levels, and I think I'm like 8 seconds over. So I have lots more that I could say, but I've run out of time, so if you have questions, please see me. I'm happy to talk about all of these papers as you will. List of papers, done.
We do have a couple questions. Courtesy of Slack, can you expand more on the gender differences in responses?
So mostly the gender differences. First, the gender population was smaller. We had about, I want to say 1,200 males respond. We had about 600 females respond, and perhaps 24 non-binary. The females tended to do their self ratings of expertise level much lower than males typically did. They also had slightly lower versions of comprehension levels, but that actually disappeared. There was no statistical significance once we codified it for the expertise self-rating. So that was the gender difference, the main one.
We have time for one more question, I think. Do you try to maintain a consistent color palette across all images to specific wavelengths, and how do you maintain consistency in communication?
So we don't necessarily have a standardized color code that we use. However, we do have colors that tend to work better for Chandra data specifically, that we typically go to over and over. We tend more towards the blues and the purples. However, to talk about color, that's like a whole other talk that I have, so I probably can't get into it, but we have 2 papers in this list that talk about color specifically, and the 3rd paper on the list is probably the best one to go to. Is that real? So that might help.
All right, thank you very much. Our next presenter is Travis Rector, talking about public communications and misconceptions regarding astronomical images.
How do I get this going?
And
Is there?
Ryan, can you?
No.
I don't know how this works.
Oh, it's.
Where's the folder?
There's
Oh, here it is.
a directory
Okay, got it.
here. Yeah, just directory with all those.
Okay, let's get going.
Okay, hi everyone. Again, my name is Travis Rector, and one of the things I do is I make many of the astronomical images you see from the national observatories, in other words, not Hubble. And what I want to talk about is some of the misconceptions and conceptions people have when they look at astronomical images. And one of my favorite things to do is whenever one of my images appears in social media is to go look and see what people are saying about it, because it gives you a lot of information about the mindset people are in. So this image appeared on IFL Science a couple years ago, and then that led to a very long thread of comments, most of which were abusive. But I did get a lot of interesting insights. So one of the things I did is I grabbed the first 4 comments on that thread that weren't just like, wow, cool, whatever. And don't take the time to read all the comment. I mean, there's 2 things to take away from these comments. One is people vastly overestimate their knowledge about astronomy. They also, of course, have terrible grammar. But all 4 of these things, and if you know Spanish, I'm not going to translate the last one for you. The important thing is that all of these in some way have to do with the veracity of the images. Are these images real? Is what we're seeing? Is it fake? Is it Photoshop? What's actually going on here? So it brings interesting questions of what is real and what's not. Now, so what I did is I picked 4 images, and the question is, which of these 4 images would the public think are real astronomical images. What do I mean by real astronomical images? I mean a telescope was involved in collecting data, and that data was used to create an image. So we know that 1, 2, and 3 are real astronomical images in the sense that telescope data was used to make them, and 4, of course, is a beautiful space art image. But if you ask the public, and Kim, we're going to do this, I think the majority of people will say 1 and 4 are real. They're going to look at 2 and say, that's a Petri dish, right? And 3, well, God knows what radio astronomers are thinking when they did that, right? I'm a radio astronomer, so I get to make fun of them. So an important thing to understand is what are people expecting? And this is especially important if your image is appearing in a non-astronomical setting. If it's in the New York Times or something like that. What visual cues will help people understand they're looking at an astronomical image? The best visual cue are stars, and the bright stars have those little crosses on, right? Diffraction sprites. And if you look at drawings, when cartoonists make pictures of space, all the bright stars have those lines on. So it's an important visual cue that helps people understand. So when people see our astronomical images, they often ask questions like, is that what it really looks like? Or are the colors real? Or this is my favorite, if I were standing right next to it, is this what I would actually see? I don't know what it means to stand right next to a galaxy, but it gives an important revelation as to what people are thinking of when they think of this. So unless you are talking about a terrestrial scene, so if you're talking about like pictures from the surface of Mars, unless it's sunlit, if it's something out in deep space, anything beyond the solar system, the answer is pretty much always no. And there's a variety of reasons. One is surface brightness is constant. Even if you get closer to something, it doesn't get brighter. And so if you can't see it from Earth, you still can't see it when you get closer. You also have issues. Our eyes are really crappy at seeing faint light, really crappy at seeing many colors. And of course, we can't see all the different types of light that are out there, like infrared and X-rays and things like that. So when I talk to the public, one of the things I do is I like to show this image of a Horsehead Nebula that was taken with the Kidd Peak 0.9 meter and say, this is what it looks like after we've taken the data from the telescope and created an image. This is what it would look like if you were standing right next to it. So when people ask, is this what it really looks like? We can say, yeah, sure, we can do this, but that's not what you want to see, right? So it's an important illustration as to what telescopes do. So when people think about telescopes, they usually think of just one factor, and that is the magnification. So take something, in other words, in everyday speak, take something that's far away and bring it closer. And the guy's asking, is this what it would look like if I were right next to it? That's what he's asking. It's just about the magnification. And what people don't understand is that telescopes also, of course, collect a lot more light than our eyes can see, and they also can see kinds of light that our eyes can't see. And it makes sense if you think about our eyes, right? Our eyes are awesome for a lot of things, but they're really crappy for collecting light. This is the largest aperture most humans have when it comes to looking at things, and it's pretty pathetic compared to the mirror and the Gemini 8-meter telescope. So an important thing to know is that at any given moment, the Gemini 8-meter mirror is collecting 1 million times more light than your eyes can see. And this brings up another interesting misconception people have about what is a professional telescope. So, I'm going to be doing a sabbatical with LSST next year, and I've been telling people I'm going to go work with this new telescope that's being built in Chile. And they're like, oh, that's really interesting. It's like, okay, this is an art schematic of what LSST looks like, and I've added this little arrow here to show a person for scale, right? We know that's what a professional telescope looks like. When you ask someone, what does a professional telescope look like, they're thinking this right here, right? So for whatever reason, you're going to Chile and you're building this guy right here. So an important thing to emphasize when you're talking with people about telescopes and the technology we use is that telescopes can do things that our eyes can't. And so when I talk with people about how we make these images, a phrase that I started to use that really resonates with people is that telescopes give us superhuman vision. Or another way of saying it is, what would be the point of building a $1 billion telescope like Hubble or LSST or something else if it saw things the exact same way that our eyes do? And when you explain it to people that way, then they're like, okay, now I'm on board. They understand that what they're seeing is important. So what our telescopes are doing is translating, what we're doing is we're translating what the telescope can see into something our eyes can see. So an important thing just to finalize, the public is with us. They want to believe in the images that we're seeing. And so it's important to give it across to them. I apologize for the language, but this is just one of my all-time favorite memes. But there are a lot of questions about how we do things. And so it is worth taking the time to help people understand that. And I'll especially say with space art, people don't necessarily understand, what is the limit of technology and what is real. So it's important to emphasize that. Am I done?
So we have time for just like question or two. So one question was, should images just always contain stars to get people to believe it's a real image?
I don't think the Chandra folk would agree that it should always contain stars. But we do often add them. So hybrid images are a very powerful way to get across it as an astronomical image and also to give it context.
And then another observation from Slack was maybe what is real and what is not real could be reframed as what is real, what is imagined and consistent with the data, and what isn't imagined and inconsistent with the data. So I don't know if you have any.
Well, one of the things I like to emphasize with people is that the images we make are real images in the sense they use real data from real telescopes of real objects in space. And we only use Photoshop to remove artifacts that are fake. So that resonates with people. Unfortunately, we tend to use terminology like false color, that when you say false color, they're like, oh, this isn't real. And then they're just shut down from the conversation. So never use the phrase false color. So real data from real telescopes of real objects. We don't modify the data. We don't sprinkle a few stars over here because it'll make it look nicer or anything like that.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So next up we have Nick Conant, and I guess I'm supposed to.
You should recognize the name of this file if you show up.
Oh, okay. So
Oh,
your
you
file should
got
be
it.
somewhere there. Oh, I randomly clicked on the correct file. So-
All right. Howdy, everybody. My name is Nick Conant. I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder in the Fisk Planetarium. And I spend all day working with faculty at the planetarium. Here's a great planetarium view of our own planetarium. And they come inside and they sit down with me for about an hour once every few days. Sometimes I get multiple in a single day, and they might come to a part in the semester where they're trying to talk about, well, I need to explain moon phases, or I'm trying to explain stellar life cycles. And I say, well, here's what other faculty have done. And they say, well, that's nice, but what I want to change it a little bit. I have my own narrative and my own way of teaching it. And I, of course, have to agree and sit down and try to figure out what we can do to accommodate how they want to teach it. What is their narrative? But there's a few things that actually I don't have to recreate every single time. There's some of them that just, if you use the real data, you don't actually have to end up recreating it. They can just speak to the same example. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't really matter what their background is, whether they're a student who's trying to teach the same thing or as a graduate student or a professor. And here's a few examples. I find that one of the really powerful ones is parallax. And they might spend all day trying to talk about parallax using a diagram like this. And with this sort of diagram, you have to ask yourself, how long would they have to talk to this diagram to get students to understand it? In some cases, they will just only end up more confused. That this actually seems like a generally better than average diagram, in my opinion, for explaining the subject. Thank you, NASA. But then the question kind of goes like, well, what are you still trying to explain? Some students will leave even after you explain all the math behind it, and they won't understand the basic concept, just the principles of how parallax works. And so in the planetarium, we do this in an all-sky view with the entire planetarium around. And let's see if we can't get this to play. So what I've done is exacerbated here the stellar parallax by a factor of 200,000 times. Yeah. And so this is, we've gotten to the part of the semester where they understand light years or parsecs. And so I can say, well, what we've done is taken all the parsecs and turned it into AUs. What does that mean? That means that a star that might be only 2.5 parsecs away, like Sirius, is now only 2.5 AUs away, astronomical units. Isn't that really interesting how you can now bring the stars so close, or imagine the Earth's orbit was so big that you can now actually see the stars. And this yellow dot going by is the sun as we're traveling around the sun once a year. So in the entire planetarium, you get more of a sense that you're riding around the sun. You can actually kind of plant them firmly in the planetarium. If you include things like Venus's orbit, you can then feel like you're almost riding around the track of the sun. One other thing I do here is that we slowly decrease the the amplitude of the stars, so that way they get more of a sense. We bring it more back down to reality, where I make it sense of 200,000 times closer, or 206, 265 times closer. We make only 20,000 times, and then 2,000 times closer. And then we can say, well, 2,000 times closer, you would hardly see any motion. And then if you say 200 times closer, it doesn't really matter. Stars are so horrendously far away that you actually get to see why astronomers need telescopes at all. And you end up teaching that as sort of a symptom. One other one is proper motion. I really love proper motion because it's so cool to visualize all the stars in the planetarium. And of course, Gaia just came out with a great way of visualizing all the proper motion of stars back in April, I think it was. And so the one you're going to see after this is a Parcos catalog still. But I have to ask, if we're trying to teach proper motion, and you say, well, that's great. I can teach somebody everything about proper motion, but it doesn't mean that they actually end up learning how fast, say, a star even zips across the sky. You can say, well, you can understand the subject, understand over huge amounts of time that the stars barely move. But exactly how fast is that? Well, with this example, I speed up time. First, I go back to the age of the pyramids. So we're just going to go back about 5,000 years. And you can see some stars like Sirius and Procyon move. I say, what about 50,000 years? We're going to go back to before the invention of writing. And you can see the stars that are shifting around the sky, but we can actually go back even further and say, if we wanted to go back millions of years, a time scale of stars, go back 1 million years into the past, we can see the stars, it's choking. There we go. We can actually see stars moving together in groups, the Hyades and Pleiades clusters that they're familiar with. Familiar constellations would be completely unrecognizable. And here's one last version of that, but with constellations going back 1 million years into the past. You have to ask, what did our early ancestors see in the sky? And does it look anything like the stories that we have now? So archaeoastronomy is kind of interesting to think about in this aspect. Now there's a few strengths that I'm not going to go over too much about this, but it's pretty much that now we have real models that explain real concepts, and they get to see it for their own eyes, so long as you do a little bit of explaining. One of the weaknesses is you do still have to do explaining, but the point is that you pretty much instantly learn it just by seeing it that one time. You can carry that your whole life and get a sense of the speeds, the randomness, the motion of all this stuff. And that's my talk.
So we have time for one question, since there's nothing online for those who are typing challenged.
How many of these effects are built into Digital Sky and other planetarium software versus how many did you have to program yourself?
Right, that's one of the ones I meant to say thank you to Digital Sky 2 and Skyscan. Because Digital Sky 2 does manage to go back, a million years into the past and go a million years into the future, and a lot of planetarium softwares don't do that. So a lot of them, even if you try to go back too far, you're still saying, well, I'm just assuming the proper motions is going to be linear the whole time, and it's not getting affected by gravity. So in this case, using like the AMNH catalog for the stars, that can help us do parallax, making the universe smaller so we can see it move, and proper motion. Those things were sort of already baked into Digital Sky 2, and I just exploited that as a teaching element.
And actually, one other question from Slack. So do you complement this with any kind of kinesthetic demo for parallax?
That's one of the interesting things, is that as there are certain kinesthetic demos that you can try to get people to do, but at a certain point you won't get them to understand the entire motion. That seeing all the stars and which ones are actually closer, you could have 1 million museum models that show little stars laid out in three-dimensional space, and you're kind of moving your head back and forth, and it doesn't do the same thing as it does here. Still getting them to, understand, like, let's ride around the sun, and I will act out that motion, try to have them act it out if you put on like Venus's orbit. So having them reenact it while they're seeing it does, I think, help reinforce it even more.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Super. And our next presenter is already coming up. Morgan Renberg. Don't forget to have fun and your presentation.
There we go. So I'm here to talk about an elephant-based rendering system. And I'm just going to jump right to my conclusion slide, which is, let's not take ourselves too seriously, because the public takes us really seriously. That meme notwithstanding, they think of what we do as sort of important, serious business. And by kind of flipping that on its head, we can open up a different way for them to look at the universe and maybe learn things that would otherwise be challenging to learn. And this thesis was the foundation of a planetarium show that we opened at the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History in January. It's kind of a basic solar system show, but along the way, we explore the objects in the solar system in a very different way. So I want to share a couple clips of that and then talk a little bit about how we implemented this.
We might not have been around that long, but we're already making our mark on the planet. Unfortunately, that's not always a good thing. Each year, we're pumping 36 billion tons of extra carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. That's like floating an elephant into the atmosphere. Well, not one elephant or two elephants, but 136 of them every second of every day. Imagine looking up into the sky and seeing nothing but gray. If CO2 were invisible, that's exactly what we'd see. For now, we've got to be careful not to get buried by all those elephants.
So I should mention that we're performing this as a live program, and so the sound that you're hearing from the presenter is like a temporary track that we were using during pre-production. Now, Fort Worth is literally the birthplace of fracking, and fossil fuel industry is the lifeblood of one of the largest cities in the country. And so even sort of talking about climate change as a concept will generate pushback in basically every show. And our frontline staff have to deal with that. But by casting it as something that's kind of whimsical and silly, we've been able, I think, to break through a lot of those problems. We have a lot fewer people kind of complaining to our staff. And I think we all know that talking about climate change can be really depressing. And this is not depressing. And often our presenters will insert a little bit about how you can, turn the lights off when you leave the house and things like that to kind of give people an action item to take home with. Here's a different approach.
Its lack of hospitality, though, hasn't stopped Mars from dominating our imagination for centuries. Perhaps that explains why we've sent more missions to Mars than anywhere else. But sending machines to other worlds is incredibly challenging, and Mars is a graveyard of failed missions. Imagine if someone handed you a basket of darts. Now, these aren't any old darts. Each costs hundreds of millions of dollars and took years to build. And if you've never thrown a dart before, your odds of hitting the bullseye are going to be pretty low, especially when your target is moving and very far away. Each dart you see represents a single mission to Mars. Notice how many throws fail completely. Over time, though, we start to figure out the right technique, and by the 2000s, we're finally hitting more than we miss.
So obviously, sending missions to Mars is not like a contentious question in the way climate change is, but it's difficult. Our audience consists of a lot of kids. And it's a difficult concept sometimes, I think, for them to understand why it would be so hard. If we have all these experts doing all of these things, why do we screw up so much? And so putting it in terms that they can understand and something that's maybe a little more visually appealing to them is a way to get their attention, to keep their attention, and to sort of move on to talk about something else. And here are a few other examples of ways that we've used that. And what our analytics are showing us is that this approach really works. We'd still like to do some sort of pre-test, post-test type studies to understand retention, but from an enjoyment standpoint, our analytics are showing us that a program like this is much more popular with the audience than the other kinds of programs that we've been doing. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
So the first question from Slack is, can you share the target age range for the elephant viz?
Yeah, so that is really for all ages. We have one program for very young kids. We use the Big Bird Planetarium show, One World, One Sky, for like first grade and down. But all of the rest of our shows are targeted at everybody. And so our core audience is like 3 through 9 plus their families. But we'll have, like any science museum, we have people of all ages. And we hope that by mixing together some of the cartoony stuff with some of the photoreal sci-vis like we had with Mars that were providing something for each of those audiences and mixing it up enough that those younger kids stay engaged, which is sometimes hard in the planetarium.
Follow up on the elephants was, is the elephant viz showing all the elephants or just the ones an average viewer on the ground would see?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Obviously, when you start being sort of silly like that, you have to kind of be blurry about what's happening. That's 136 elephants floating up. But of course, those would be distributed across the whole Earth. And so one person wouldn't see them. But that's only also a few seconds of elephants. And over hundreds of years, obviously, they would have built up. So you can't get too tied down to the specifics of the visualization. It's important to get across sort of the key intent.
And then I think the last question was, what about Uranus in terms of the list of scenes used? So we don't
Yeah, so Uranus was a somewhat challenging one for us. We had a sort of a goofy object come in and whack. So each planet has their label, and the object comes in and whacks the Uranus label, and it kind of falls over on its side to illustrate one possible formation mechanism for the way we see Uranus today.
Thanks very much. So, next up, Michelle Biotti, talking about STEM stories, a cognitive humanistic perspective on visual storytelling.
Yeah, kind of a mouthful, huh?
But a great way to have enough of a pause to get your PowerPoint up running.
Exactly. Okay.
I think when you're up, we'll switch over.
There we go. Okay, so hello everyone. I am really focused on the storytelling part of this session, and I've always been really interested in how the brain works and how we process information. One of the key questions for me is really how do we share the discoveries of our age? And when I look at a lot of visualizations, I look at this from a perspective of, is this really a visual story? We talk about Mars and the record of the history of Mars is written in the rocks. Is that a story? And a lot more opportunities for data science storytelling is occurring, and we look at the data and try and figure out what it's telling us. A lot of times these can really be narrative explanations, but not necessarily story. And so because you're in Southern California, I'm going to show the Bible for aspiring screenwriters, a great book called Story. And a key point made in it is that a really good story is not about necessarily what we want to communicate, but starting with the audience and a desire to touch that audience. If I tell you a story of a breakfast that my mother made me when I was 6, what's happening is that you're activating all kinds of schema and mental models of breakfast, the sun coming up over the horizon, what it means to be 6, what the concept of mother is. And we can use devices like that in story structure, in educational terminology, conceptual change models that can kind of mimic hero's journey representations of story. There are many models of information processing, and in this case, it's multimedia learning theory. And for those of you who process data, you're really used to visual encodings and efficiencies that can be used for that. There are strategies in visualizations for avoiding too much cognitive load. And the key thing is that efficient narrative encoding is not just communicating facts, but telling stories, because it ignites so many different parts of the brain, emotion, motor, all of those things. In terms of storytelling, there is an art, and I'm going to borrow from the tradition of interpretation, which a lot of our national parks colleagues use, and really look at how interpretation is a revelation based on information. It's not just the facts, but we're trying to provoke something and to provoke interest and motivation. A great book called The Passionate Fact really talks about this and creating a relationship with the viewer. And another favorite book of mine is called Humanistic Geography. And it takes a look at texture of place and doesn't just treat it from a distance, but says, hey, we're here. This landscape means something to us. And in the context of this, a question that I have is that, is there a brain-based humanistic visual astronomy storytelling? Again, a mouthful. But the idea of, you know, where are we in time and space? What do we know? What do we want to know? And how do we tell that story? Sometimes we can get really hemmed in by the scientific method and observation and objectivity. But a lot of recent neuroscience findings really talk about the fact that we feel, therefore we learn. So when we feel something, we're actually processing it much more extensively in our brains. Without emotion, all of the facts and information has less support. And basically, a lot of the recent neuroscience findings are looking at what's emotional thought. This is really important. This diagram is actually refined by a colleague from one of the art museums, and we're pretty familiar with this, where the general public has shallower knowledge, et cetera, and our job is to transfer knowledge. The key thing here is that often we're trying to transfer expertise, but really for the general public, transferring content is really, or context rather, is really important. And so there's a difference between sense making and meaning making. Sense making is what is it and its comprehension. And meaning making is about, does it matter? What's the significance? And so here are two beautiful diagrams, which I love. And they are really for sense making because a lot of visualizations are produced for media purposes and explaining the science, et cetera. There's a meaning to this. And the key is, you know, maybe it's life, maybe it's appreciation for our home world. How do we convey that meaning? Because the general public isn't going to learn by doing the way experts do over time, socialization, learning by sharing is really important. And so the key for me, and I'd love to talk about this more with any of you who are interested, it's really looking at how do we combine narrative story and visual representation and an efficient mechanisms on both sides to bring those together. So if you're interested, I'm around and have more time than 5 minutes.
We currently have no questions from Slack, so if anyone wants to jump in with a question.
Does astronomy have any easier or harder time with this visual storytelling than other scientific disciplines?
I think it depends because it's where are you starting with in the context of your audience. For instance, you know, here in LA, we don't even see the stars, so that can sometimes be harder with a relationship. But it's also tapping into things like, you know, there's a description of the Perseids and meteor shower. And, you know, if you're in your backyard and you're like, oh, I saw a shooting star, you know, it's really starting with place. And sometimes we were having this discussion yesterday, astronomy sometimes has this ethereal, slow, melodic kind of sensibility to it. And so it really just depends on your audience and how they're interpreting that based on the message you want and the schema they have.
How do you define or work with maybe the pre-associations or the prerequisite knowledge required to make sure that your visualization or your story is interpreted the way you would like it to be interpreted versus being counteracted by what they're coming in with?
Yeah, and that's absolutely a fair point because the slide that I showed back here exactly gets to that whether you're showing someone something for the first time in particular or telling them what I'm saying to you may have different manifestations, but part of it is really trying to recognize and study like what are people getting from those messages. Are they really, like if you have a visualization product, doing a test with people and figuring out is the message you were trying to convey exactly what they were getting and then refining from there.
One more quick question.
Yeah, Shai, can you go back to the hero journey slide? I just really love that slide because
sure.
As an educator, I really feel like my job is to start students on that journey, to go from a student to someone who's not even just a scientist, just a productive member of society who make me happy, right? So I really appreciate you putting that in there.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the joy of our job. I mean, we really get to take people beyond what they know and then bring it back to themselves. And it's really a privilege to be able to do that. So thanks.
All right, thank you very much. And I lost my page with my schedule, but
all right, how do we get to the just escape? Okay.
And yeah. So next up is Brandon Loughton talking about view space, leveraging NASA visualizations to tell compelling news stories in informal learning venues.
All right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is another mouthful. So this ViewSpace product is one way in which we share stories from NASA astrophysics. And so I want to just sort of go through this just to give you an idea what ViewSpace is and how we go about creating these stories. So first of all, ViewSpace is a product of NASA's Universal Learning. And as Gordon said earlier in the day when he did the introductions, that in 2015, NASA SMD awarded 27 programs, that competitively awarded 27 programs, of which NASA's Universal Learning is one, and I know there's others in the room as well. And some of the objectives you see on the right here for the entire NASA SMD landscape, if you will, are to enable STEM learning, improve scientific literacy, advance national education goals, and leverage through partnerships. And we feel like NASA's Universal Learning has a strength in meeting those goals because of our partnerships here. So you can see the partnerships at the bottom. And really, it's our direct connection to the science that allows us to do that. Okay, so we have, you know, at our institutions and also through our partnerships with other institutions across NASA astrophysics, we have a direct connection to the data, to the scientists, the subject matter experts, and so on. And then we funnel that information through our various Universal Learning program elements, which are listed there. And I'll just mention that ViewSpace is one of the products within those program elements. So what is ViewSpace? ViewSpace is a modular and multimodal self-updating multimedia exhibit that has over 10 hours of content, and it's updated frequently. You can see on the reach map here, we are shown in more than 200 museums, science centers, planetariums, libraries, and other learning venues across the United States. It's an accessible entry point to NASA Science and Stories, and of course, another good thing to point out is that it's entirely free. The platform and the content is entirely free. Okay, so covering NASA science and how science is done. In 5 minutes, I don't have time, there's over 10 hours of content, and if I just showed you one video, I'd be probably out of time. So I just want to put some highlights that we've done in the last year or so up here for ViewSpace shows that we worked in partnership across Universal Learning to create. On the top left is an In a Different Light segment, which tells stories whereby we visualize famous objects in the universe and showcase them across the electromagnetic spectrum to allow you to understand what you can learn about these objects when you view them in different types of light. On the top right, we created a show that connects the 2017 eclipse with astrophysics. In this case, we have Sir Arthur Eddington's expedition here, and we connect it to things like gravitational lensing and so on. So there we're leveraging a very famous, or I mean a very popular event that happened, and this was released in advance of the eclipse. You've already seen many stills from the TRAPPIST-1 release, but in the bottom left there, we created a showcase on not just the TRAPPIST-1 release, but really I put this here because it shows how we leverage our partnerships. The Spitzer team did some wonderful graphics, the Spitzer and JPL teams, I should say, did some wonderful graphics and visualizations, which we were able to then incorporate quickly into this NASA ViewSpace show. And then on the bottom right here, you see another example where we partnered with various NASA astrophysics missions, as well as the LIGO team to tell the story of the new multi-messenger astronomy and understanding the connection between gravitational waves and the sources that create them. So that just gives you a flavor, and I'd love to talk with anyone after this at some point. If you want to see the actual shows themselves, I would love to share that with you. I just want to quickly go, how do we create the stories of NASA science? So we always start with learning goals and the science content and themes that we want to share. Okay, so we start with learning goals. What do we want folks to learn from this segment, and what is the science content and themes? We do an iterative outline design process here where we create an outline, we review it, and so on. I should note that in the course of creating these ViewSpace segments, scientists and educators are included in all design and review phases. After we're happy with our outline, we want to provide our key messages, script and storyboard creation, and again, a review. Again, it's an iterative design process. Then we move to the video design process and final reviews, at which point then it gets distributed via the internet on our ViewSpace network. And then I'll just end real quickly by saying, by showing one recent case study we did where we, again, it was really our connection to the NASA data that helped us produce this quickly. So we wanted to leverage sort of the excitement of an anniversary. Anniversaries are common things that NASA likes to celebrate. And so we celebrated the 28th anniversary of Hubble, and we knew that coming from, working with Hubble, we knew that there was going to be this great data coming down of the Lagoon Nebula. And then, of course, across Universal Learning, we reached out to our partners. Okay, we reached out to our partners, and we got them to, we worked together to get data across NASA astrophysics missions, and we produced this in a different light segment. And so I can just cycle through. There's Spitzer archival observations from 2011. There was also WISE observations in the show. There's Chandra archival observations, and then there's the sort of for the first time ever, this was created for the show, this multi-wavelength image of these Spitzer, Chandra, and Hubble observations. And we could really tell the story of this star-forming region and what are star-forming regions and what's going on in them in a new way by utilizing this new data. And then I will just end by showcasing this. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. Sure.
First, a thank you. That rocks. Awesome job. Then we have a question. Are there any plans to open it up for casual viewing online outside of museums?
That's a great question. We have initial talks about what that will entail. Of course, you can imagine that bandwidth and things like that are an issue, but we are in initial conversations about what that means to open it up to a casual audience outside of informal learning venues. That's a different audience, and that's something that we're actively exploring.
And just one last quick question. Could view-based content assets be packaged for institutions to reuse in facilitated experiences rather than passive viewing?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. So these visualizations that we incorporate into ViewSpace, we could absolutely make them available as is, and we could, and in fact, in a lot of cases we do that because they don't always start with ViewSpace. Sometimes for ViewSpace, we take them and we put them in ViewSpace. So for those that are interested in a particular visualization that they see within ViewSpace, we'd be happy to work with them to get them the source of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. We have, I believe, Joe. Joe gets a small when 2D isn't enough and 3D is too much.
Should be there somewhere.
Okay, so I actually would like to revise my title to when 2D is great, but 3D requires more time, effort, resources, and complexity than you have time for. Of course, the images we get from these telescopes are amazing in their own right, but as any good astrophysicist, we want to tell a story that goes along with it, and we're always looking for ways to engage the audience in new ways and help tell the story even better. And I want to thank Brendan for showing the Lagoon Nebula in his talk, because that's directly related to the content of my talk. This is a nice ground-based view of the center of the Milky Way. And in this top little region up here, that little pink area is the area of the Lagoon Nebula. And just for context, there you go. That little red square is the size of the field of view that Hubble sees in the lagoon. And that's actually 4 pointings stitched together. So that's something that people don't usually get. The size of the field of view of Hubble is so tiny, and seeing such a small portion of the sky. So let's zoom into that box. There's another ground-based view. And there's the Hubble observation for the 28th anniversary image of the Lagoon Nebula. We had 4 orbits, about 9 hours total exposure time across some narrow, medium, and IR filters. And then this was the resulting image. And we wanted to try and tell a story beyond just looking at the image and seeing it passively. What's going on here? And just to back up 1 second, there are these really bright stars off to the side here that are actually causing ionization fronts down to traverse down the side of this this region here, like that. So this is sort of the story we wanted to tell. We wanted to try to develop this in a pseudo 3D format. We called it 2.5D to try and break up the different parts of this scene. We worked with some colleagues at Space Telescope who study star-forming regions to figure out what's the three-dimensional structure of this and how can we best represent that in a sort of decoupage method. So we have the stellar winds coming down from the O stars. We have a really bright star in the center buried in the dust that's also causing radiation to go out and changing this area here in ways that it's separate from the radiation coming from the O stars that are off the frame. And so we developed this model, this mental model of what this region looks like, how these formation processes are happening. So we have these ionization ridges coming from those bright stars. We have what we call the dark waterfall and the dark ridge. And these things are all sort of in the foreground. Then we have that hot O star in the middle that's causing these pillars to form. And we have these bow shocks and these tiny pillars down at the bottom there. And then of course we have dotted throughout this image a few stars. Because it's narrowband, most of them are gone. But we use all this information to then put together a model. And the first step is to remove the stars. So we can take them out, and that's done through Photoshop using content-aware fill and various things like that. Then we deconstruct the full model, the full image. And basically what we want here is to have something that's behind the foreground so that when you move the camera around, you get parallax, there's something behind it. So not exactly making it up, but using sort of informed guesses of what could be behind there. And then once that's all together, you lay it out in 3 dimensions, you can move around it, you get that parallax view. Oops. Then you get, oh, this isn't playing. There we go. This was the final product. One of the sequences that we put together as you travel down the ionization ridges and then down across the center of the image. And so we hope that this helps engage people to understand the story of how this star forming region came about in a new way, in a way that's sort of visually engaging. And then I'll leave you with a really wide view of Lagoon Nebula that I took from Joshua Tree National Park a few nights ago. Thanks.
When you create an image like that, do you orient it to appear that most light comes from the above, the classic top left, different orientations lead to different understandings of the images?
That's a good question. Yes, so there is the sort of standard north is up view that we typically would use, but we're not wed to that. We can also move the image around, we can rotate and crop to highlight different regions, and yes, that is used to help drive the understanding of what the image is showing you.
How do you decide on the degree of parallax to integrate into the 3D reconstruction? Basically, how much exaggeration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously we're kind of guessing at how far apart these things are. And there's a balance between aesthetics and science. You want to be able to see that movement. And the stars is actually a really good example of that. The stars are what drive a lot of that parallax as they move across the field much quicker than anything else in the region. And so that's a case where the balance is tipped towards the aesthetics because you want to have that feeling of parallax. So the stars are definitely sort of guessed at where they would be to give you that sense of parallax.
How long did it take to process the image like that before the creation?
That took about a week. There was making the image and then pulling it apart, deconstructing it to make the 3D. That took about a week.
And when creating the 3D models, do you use any scientific data to correctly display what is closer or farther from the viewer, red and shift?
Well, like I said, we worked with some colleagues at Space Telescope to understand in basic terms how these star formation regions form, and use that to inform our decisions on where to place things. But ultimately, it comes down to scientifically informed aesthetics. And
we have a few seconds left. Have you done any user response surveys or studies to see how people respond to the 2.5-ish?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I actually am not involved in that work, so I would actually love to find out how people react to these videos. Yeah.
We have found really good response to our 2.5D. Almost not quite the same as the whole 3D, but for a lot less work, let's say.
So these are learning games, or
we don't have any. We don't have the learning data in terms of that, but at least in terms of the audience response that we get back through various channels, it's almost as good, but for a lot less work.
Sure. YouTube comments, Facebook comments, they're always wow.
Okay, next up we have Brian Day, exploring planetary surfaces with NASA's solar system
Should be somewhere there. Yeah.
cursor is cursors on that screen.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay. So Brian Day with the NASA Solar System TREX program. I'm here with Emily Law. We've got our team at JPL. In addition to mission planning tools, the Solar System TREX portals end up being really good tools for storytelling. And you're going to learn a lot more about the TREX during this meeting in the next couple of days. But one of the things we have are some canned stories, some canned narrated stories that are going to be part of our new website. And these tell stories of the featured worlds, but also how to use the TREX. So I'm going to start out by playing one of these right now. And we have short 10-minute intro or 10-second intros and longer ones.
A 3D view of Vesta Trek. Vesta is large enough to have achieved hydrostatic equilibrium as it formed. That means that it should have a nice spherical shape. But the 3D view of Vesta shows it to be far from spherical. It almost looks like a good part of the southern portion of Vesta is missing. That's because that is exactly what has happened. Approximately 1 billion years ago, an asteroid slammed into Vesta's south pole. The impact was almost fatal for Vesta, leaving a crater called Rhea Silvia that is about 500 kilometers across. Keep in mind that Vesta itself is only 525 kilometers across. Rhea Silvia is 19 kilometers deep, so this giant impact excavated material from deep beneath Vesta's surface. As is the case with many large craters, Rhea Silvia has a peak of uplifted material in its center. Rhea Silvia's central peak is very impressive, rising 23 kilometers above the low spot on the crater floor. To put this into perspective, Mount Everest, the highest spot on Earth, rises only 8.8 kilometers above sea level. To get a good view of Rhea Silvia, use Vesta Trek's south polar projection and select the color hillshade layer. The Rhea Silvia impact wasn't the only major cataclysm to strike this area of Vesta. Another, older giant impact created Venenia crater, some 400 kilometers in diameter. The younger Rhea Silvia crater overlaps and has obliterated much of Venenia, but you can still see a portion of Venenia sticking out from Rhea Silvia. Again, use Vesta Trek's south polar projection and color hillshade layer for your best view.
So we can have these canned presentations, but then we can take advantage also of the TREX interactivity. And you can do interactive walks across planetary surfaces. This is kind of inspired by going to a national park and having a ranger-led nature tour. And for instance, here what we'll do is we'll fly down into an area on the eastern rim of the Hellas Basin. And as we do so, we can see a beautiful impact crater with a really thick ejecta blanket around this. We call this a rampart crater. And we see that interesting raised area behind it, and that is actually what we call a lobate debris apron. That's a glacier on Mars. And so if we look straight down on this, we can see a really interesting story. So we see where a meteoroid impacted the surface of Mars, and you had this sploosh of wet material because there was ice and water beneath the surface, and so you've got a very concentrated ejecta blanket around it. And then if you look carefully, you can actually see that there are fluvial features. So water actually flowed across the surface of Mars, radiating away from this. And then later, this glacier advances across the ejecta blanket. So there's stories to be told here. So if you have someone who is well trained in planetary geomorphology, you can do this just as a random walkout and walk across the surface and see what is, interpret what's to be told. Or you can go and plan things in advance and see certain things to interpret. I'd point out that every year that AGU happens in San Francisco, we do one of these events at the California Academy of Sciences in the Morrison Planetarium. And you sit there and we walk across these surfaces of these worlds, and we look at wonderful features. So next time AGU is in San Francisco, I will invite you to come out to the Cal Academy for the special session there. And please do attend tomorrow, our hands-on demo. Thank you.
The first question, is there a way to show a color sheet with an ill-shaped palette?
Say again, please.
Is there a way to show a color sheet for the ill-shaped palette?
Yes, so one of the things that you will find is in the Trex, you can bring up the individual layers, and then there will be ways to actually, if there's color coding, it will show you the interpretation. So there's actually a guide for that.
And a more lighthearted question, is sploosh a scientific term, or was it more of a complaint?
You know, sploosh is something that came up when we started. We've been using this product with a lot of kids in after-school programs, and the Rampart creators really got to them. And so they had actually kids recreating what Rampart creators, throwing rocks into mud with sand and gravel on top, and actually recreating, and everybody used the term sploosh, and damn it, I'm using it now too.
Any more questions from Zoom or internal?
How do you, every creator must have its own story. How do you choose which ones to focus on?
So there are different themes that we will use. So some of the times when you have creators that are telling the story of water on Mars, where it currently is, sometimes you use, you're telling a story about using craters to tell chronology on a planetary surface. And so you take a look at the underlying story, and then you pick your craters to illustrate the points in that story. Okay, thank you.
Visualizing web concepts from process to product.
Hi. So I predominantly work on the web team at STSCI. I actually don't come from an astronomy background. I come from the kind of the medical arena, which has a lot of the same issues as the astronomy one, which is a lot of the concepts are abstract, complicated, and in general are just kind of hard to share with the public. So I'll be sharing kind of how we went from visualizing web's tools and views, and then making it accessible to the public. So basically you're working on sharing complex information and abstract ideas visually, which I find useful to scaffold the information. So going from one concept to concept two, but making sure you understand the first concept before going to the second, and repeating like the same idea in different ways. So people don't always learn from the first view. Sometimes you need 3 different views before someone really visualizes it in their head. And then taking a complex idea and making it friendly. So like spectroscopy is terrifying to someone who doesn't understand spectroscopy. Like for me, it was really hard to understand. So just making it friendly and accessible and kind of playing with it and making it fun. And then staying consistent, so like color palettes, all that kind of stuff. And having the story kind of continuously flow and make the public feel small, which I find, especially with my friends who aren't familiar with astronomy, that's something that holds a lot of people together, is just how big the universe really is. And then breaking the scene is something I try not to do when working with the public. So you want to take one item, kind of shift it to the next scene, so you always have a reference point, and then using reference points that the public is familiar with. So like starting with Earth and then moving outward and then using an object to move from point to point. So specifically for this video on the field of regard, which is basically what Webb's rotation is, but not specific to the instruments themselves. we had a small on-site team. So there's a few designers, a few writers. The scientists are really important for the designers who work on this because we're not from an astronomy background. So using a lot of the information they give us is really important. And then using iterations, communicating directly between the scientists and the artists and the writers, and then externally reaching out to other scientists who know the subject matter better than the designers and the writers. So our process for that would be, we actually have a scientist create the first storyboard, which I think is kind of strange for some people. We have them kind of pick out images that kind of explain the concept they think it should be, the way they think it should be explained, and then kind of laying out the story the way they think it should be told. And then what we do then is kind of build out from there. So we create a larger storyboard where we then get approved by the scientists. We get feedback back from them. We get feedback from writers to really get a cohesive story and make it friendly enough for the public, but still keeping the accuracy and making it understandable. And then I think I have time. This is the actual animation we created. I also love your guys' feedback as well. We just got this approved. And this goes over the field of regard for James Webb. So this is just what the instrument will see over the entirety of the year, showing how, well, I'll just play it, makes more sense.
Which parts of the sky can the Webb telescope see? The James Webb Space Telescope orbits the Sun in sync with Earth, but 1 million miles further out, beyond the Moon. The telescope's mirror is perpendicular to the 70-foot sun shield, which keeps it cool. The telescope's movement is limited in certain directions to keep the mirror and scientific instruments in the shade of the sun shield, blocked from the heat of the sun. But Webb can rotate to get a 360-degree view of the sky. As Webb orbits the Sun, different celestial objects enter its available field of view. Science observations with the telescope will be carefully scheduled to make the most effective use of Webb's time. Over the course of 6 months, Webb has access to the entire sky.
Okay. And then basically the last scene, you skip to showing an entire solar system view. So you're always pulling the reference point from Earth out to what the tool can do and then back into our solar system. But
after scientists create the initial storyboard, do you find it difficult to make significant changes? Or are scientists in your experience willing to accept input on modifying the story?
So far, my experience, the scientists have been very much open to changing the storyboards, especially when you come up with a secondary storyboard to show visually how you think it should flow. Usually once you show them kind of how the story can change and really what the visual process should be, a lot of times they're like, all right, we'll go with that. But you always have to make edits for accuracy as well.
How do you reconcile the errors of scale in your synchronous orbit for the video?
Mainly we just, a lot of time we use just a label of not to scale, just because it is so hard to show the full scale, showing Webb versus the Moon versus Earth versus the solar system. It's just such an intense scale change that there's always more information on it, but just for the concept we're trying to show, that's not the most important part.
know how self-sufficient you are. So
Things are for everybody else. All right. It's here. Whoops. This is not self-sufficient, Ryan. No, it's okay. It's my mess up. Okay. So I'm going to take 5 minutes and tell you a little bit about something I think is just unbelievably amazing that we're doing at the American Museum of Natural History. And that is visualizing the Gaia DR2 data, which if you aren't excited about it, hopefully by the end of this you are, because I'm insanely excited about this data set. I think it's the most important astronomical catalog we've ever had in the universe in the history of humans. So if you want to see more about it that you can't see in this talk, follow me on Twitter. This is actually an image of a program that I put on last week, and I'm going to actually be using these 5 minutes to kind of give you the storytelling we've been doing from the science side. But this is an image taken at the American Museum of Natural History at a program I ran where we took Gaia data and visualized it, which you can see in there. I'm in the center of the screen there, presenting to 90 researchers that were in New York City to hack Gaia to try and get at interesting scientific progress. And science was pouring out of it. And this is actually 900 million stars rendered. Moment of silence for that. And we flew through it, and it was amazing. But I can't actually fly through it for you right now because it'll break my computer. So I'm going to show you snippets of the kinds of data that we played with. And in so doing, I'm actually going to highlight the people that also gave it to me. This is a little clunky because this is me flying around it in party view, though everything we did was in open space that Carter's going to talk about later. And so I will sell open space to anyone and everyone. This is an image of the galaxy. And I call it pointillism of the galaxy. We no longer need a 2D image. You can fly out from this beautiful image that you can create through stars only. And these are upper main sequence stars. And so prior to Gaia, we actually didn't have a really good handle on distances to upper main sequence stars. And as we fly around, you can turn on the OB associations, because you can see that these high mass stars actually map out star forming regions. And it's so cool because you can see these fingers of God aspects that Gaia struggles in overdensity areas. And then boom, you just see it right here. A lot of astronomers were like, oh, that's so much easier when you see it like this. You can also flip on an image of the galaxy. I'm just going to flip it on and flip it off. And what you'll see is that you can actually start looking at the spiral arm structure of the galaxy in a visualization like this. Here's another one that we did. I love this one, and this made a bunch of astronomers lose their minds. This is a view from Earth of apogee and Galah data. It's high-resolution spectroscopy. Color-coded here are stars they're color-coded by metallicity. So this is actually a flight through the chemical abundance of hundreds of thousands of stars at their appropriate distances. And as you fly out, what you actually can see is something that's intuitive, but way more intuitive when you see it like this, is a gradient where you're seeing the higher metallicity is the green stars and lower metallicity is the bluer stars. So you're seeing this gradient where the higher metallicity stars are closer in and they're in the disk, and farther out when you get towards the halo, they're lower metallicity. And we can actually switch to different abundances. It's super cool. Here's an image of Kepler. The other thing we have is time. And so one thing people were looking at was Megan Bedell was really interested in co-moving things in Kepler. So you got time, you got proper motions, turn it on. And what I thought was so cool was that I hadn't realized that the original Kepler had a bunch of open clusters in it. And we just plopped it up there and you see them fly with each other. I moved time forward a couple million years and then I reversed and whoop, this is what they do when they came from. Isn't that cool? I can watch this for hours.
Are those the clusters, the really bright bits in that one?
Oh, Robert, I only have 5 minutes. You're trying to steal one of my 5 minutes? I'll show it to you.
No, go.
I can actually show it better on my laptop anyway. This is my favorite one, in part because I curated it. And this is a catalog of co-moving stars that you can see the little clumps and clusters of them. This is actually the Beehive, the Pleiades, and the Hyades. I'm going to turn time on. And this is why this one's so cool, every one of these stars, it's a co-moving catalog, should have a partner. It should be co-moving with something. It could be moving with 1 star, it could be moving with 2 and 3 and 4. And I pulled all their radial velocities from Gaia DR2, and instead of doing the annoying, painstaking thing of like checking things, I've been flying around it and finding when things actually co-move and don't. So from a scientific perspective, this is like way more fun to do it this way, and we can tell great stories this way. So my takeaways from this are, and I can show anybody this on my laptop, well, portions of it. Gaia DR2 data, the most important astronomical catalog of all time, demands visualization tools for scientists. Open space and party view are powerful tools for investigating it, both for the scientific narrative and for the public. And Drop the Mic on Open Space rendered 900 million stars in an immersive dome experience last week. That's it.
It was obvious in your next video, so
Okay.
sorry.
All right, your first argument is in the visualization of metallicity, it is clear that there was a radial gradient of high to low metallicity from the position of the Earth. Is that correct, or did
It could be. I'm not sure. That one I'd have to talk about. I'll run it, even though I'm not sure I'll be able to see whatever the question is. That's a good science question, whoever asks that. What we saw was both a metallicity gradient that was going from the disk, which is why I put the image of the galaxy, out to the halo. But there's also a gradient that goes from the inner galaxy to the outer part of the galaxy, which I hadn't realized until we started visualizing it. So that is in the data, if that's what somebody was asking.
how much of this render could be adapted VR hardware render? This uses screen or immersion.
It's definitely immersion, but I highly recommend doing this in a dome and not in VR, because you can storytell way better when we are all in a dome together. And that VR, well, I think this would be great to do. And actually the Gaia team has Gaia Sky, which is also a great tool, and they've produced some VR tools that are super great. But I'm very into the idea of the storytelling in a dome, taking people through, watching people's reactions as you see the data, and being able to continue the conversation live.
What was the frame rate at which this was rendered in real time?
So I did all of these renderings were done on my laptop last night. Roughly last night, with party view. And so I don't know what the render rate was. This is why I'm saying it's a little clunky. This is not the polished tool that Ryan will produce at Cal Academy, that Carter will produce at AMNH. This is for me to show you how the scientists can immerse themselves in it and start digging in their data, and then you find your stories. Find the data set that you like, throw it in here, and you can play with it yourself.
Thank you.
Thoughts, reactions? We have such amazing presenters that actually stayed on time and actually got us right back on schedule, even after starting a couple minutes late. So that is to free us up to have an exciting, intellectually stimulating conversation. Everyone in the room.
Can we use our mouths this time, or do we have to type?
This section, we're allowing you to actually speak. So, I don't know if someone can echo any questions that come from Zoom or Slack. Well, I guess looking at the thread of storytelling, I think what's interesting is that we had storytelling from scientists, storytelling from sort of public outreach specialists and such. I guess a question that comes to mind is how this continuum works. I thought it was interesting that the web team initially worked with the scientists to kind of create the storyboard and then to iterate from there. But I guess one of the things that our team in-house at the Academy is very much an astronomy-savvy educator team. We don't have any in-house astronomers. We have fellows who are astronomers. We talk to those people. But how do you find sort of that continuum of scientists to educators, communicators, and audience? How can we refine that pipeline to not only make sure that the science is correct, but on the audience side, make sure that it's actually understandable?
Yeah, I was at our museum. Morgan gave that talk about the way we were doing that with that one show. And one of the things, when I got there, we had two cadres of folks. One were astronomy students that were working there as part-time presenters. The other was theatrically trained people. And we kind of made the decision to put all our eggs in theatrically trained people because of that engagement thing, the fact that they could really listen to the audience and adjust what they're talking about with questions. But that comes with the caveat that they don't know the science, and if they get pulled off into a different realm, that that they could be out of their league. They definitely don't feel comfortable doing that. We don't want them doing that. So that's the challenge of it. But I think that when done well, and they can kind of contain what they're talking about in a script, that the live engagement with somebody who knows how to do that is really much better than a scientifically trained person that doesn't know how to do that communication.
One thing I found to be effective with communicating data that's actual data is to actually not only share your visualization of it, but to share the raw data that you began with, so people can see where you were coming from, and they can have like a reference to understand what does it mean if you remove cosmic ray hits or you composited things to color, so that they have they can actually go back and forth between the visualization and the raw material. There's a lot of planetary missions that have tripped up on communicating about like their first view of an asteroid where it's only a few pixels across, so they blow it up, and then people don't understand why it looks so fuzzy. And so if you can show them what you started with, then it really helps get the point across about what the visualization is trying to show.
So at Space Telescope, we've been talking about this for years, the scientist-educator partnership in our formal education program. I would say in visualization, we have that same thing because we've got, 6 astronomers embedded in OPO who have learned enough of storytelling that they can counterbalance the research ones who come in and try and get all these difficult concepts across. And by having the PhDs inside the Viz team, they will listen to us better than sometimes they would just listen to an animator or designer. That helps, but not everybody has that luxury of that, so it's really difficult. And I'd like to pose another question to talk about is how we avoid misconceptions. We started talking about that in some of these things. It's so really hard to avoid misconceptions because you can't put the mindset of every audience member in your head when you're creating it.
This one question I have is how do you then gauge the efficacy of your end product as you work with scientists?
Let me expand that because I just want to blow it out in general because we've had a little bit of discussion of metrics, and Kim has talked a lot, has studied more than anyone in the room on how the aesthetics affect people and what is working or not. But in general, we have a lot of people that we do a lot of stuff that we feel intuitively works, but what fraction of people here are actually actively engaged in getting metrics back for what they do and understanding is it really achieving goals or not?
Well, actually, metrics. Can we separate that to metrics to appeal and metrics of actual didactic results? So, how many people measure? Do people like it? Sort of appeal. Okay, so that's the vast majority of the room. And how many people judge the efficacy of the educational outcomes of the content? A much smaller number.
Can I add to that? Sure. NASA's science activation group, the competitively awarded, part of all of those programs is that there needs to be external evaluation on are they meeting those SMD objectives? Is there STEM learning happening? Is there those sorts of things? And so I think for those programs, I think we're going to learn in the next several years some good details about some of these questions.
There are multiple literacies that underlie so many of these visualizations, and I think when we're looking at measuring comprehension, that we really have to also look at, where people start and what supports we put in these also help scaffold that understanding from that novice to expert pathway perspective. And so I think the expectations that we have of some audience groups don't have to be that expert model. Often, sometimes, like we want them to have that already, but that takes time and it takes repetition and multiple representations of the same data. And as a community, I think that that's one of the things that we're here to talk about too, is how do we all work together from our own individual places to coalesce around big themes and ways to represent it.
So one of the things I've been working on a lot at the planetarium at Fisk is that we have undergraduate students that we hire to be our presenters. And oftentimes we find that the students who are that have struggled in the past can bring it down with astronomy, can bring down that level as they're presenting. They know the misconceptions, they know what the troubles are, they empathize more with people who ask the questions, and they might have some confusion. And they're better at the Q&A parts of our presentations than people who might just be traditionally high-performing students who've never had to question astronomy.
I think, and I can't remember if it was in your talk, Michelle, but someone talked about the sort of internal process of understanding versus the social process of constructing meaning. And I think it is interesting when you push students into this mode where they're socializing that learning. Clearly, that's something that we're seeing is very successful and doesn't happen often, at least in planetariums. So it's interesting to think about how we can combine visualizations with that kind of social learning. Of course.
Yeah. So my group comes at this a little bit differently, but this was sort of brought up in some of the talks we touched on. So a lot of times what you're trying to do is you're trying to show, either educate or wow people or whatever with some kind of scientific result. Now, in the things that I've seen in here, a lot of those results are actually sort of inherently visual. In other words, if I were to say to you, here's a result we want to visualize, and by the way, this result is not based on looking at the stars. I mean, there aren't stars in the result. The analysis, whether it was age of the stars or whatever, the analysis isn't inherently visual. It's a story that wants to be told, but it's not inherently visual. So at that point, when my group becomes involved in this, then our job is to make it inherently visual. So that's like an experiment. We have to take what the scientist says the result is, and we have to take the data and try to see if we can't come up with a representation of the data that makes it inherently visual. I particularly like the one that was shown, for instance, of Kepler from the Gaia data and the like, because you're starting to say, normally you just show a picture of the data, but by showing where it is in space relative to the Earth, you start to make it inherently visual. Now, what's the problem? The problem comes with some of the talk about storyboarding, right? Storyboarding, unfortunately, has a basis in I already know what I'm going to see. In other words, so it's like a director saying, at this point, the monster attacks the hero and the hero shoots with a so-and-so. You, special effects guy, go off and visualize that. Knowing that the visualizer, animator can probably do that. With us, it's different. It's more like, here's the story, here's the real data. Can you make it visual? Our idea is, well, let's try an experiment. Let's see if we can tell a story that's going to be more relatable to the average person so that the story can be told in a clearer manner. And I think our people we work with, like Scott over here, know that a lot of times we say, we don't know yet. We don't even know what the result is going to be visually. When we come up with it, then we can start to build a storyboard around that. But before we do it, we just have to say, sorry, we don't know yet. And that means that some of the stuff that I saw here, forget who did it, I apologize, who was doing the storyboarding, didn't mention the fact that sometimes where the story starts is seeing that visual that some person or visualizer has done and then building a story around it. You can't just say, I'm going to build it because I know the visual is going to work. Sometimes you have to have the visual in order to go someplace with it, and then it becomes an interesting and somewhat difficult process, very technical, not artistic, because Artistic would mean you're designing it yourself. Technical means you're using the actual data to try to come up with a visual.
Can I respond to that? Because I think that was my thought. So I agree with that. And so just to give you an idea, for view space, what we do, right, is we do use existing visualization. So we've already got that step. So by the time we get to the storyboard, we already know what we're going to use. And so the storyboarding is really trying to create new stories out of existing assets for the most part. And there are a few times where we have to go back and create new visualizations, but it's really the quick turnaround and getting these new stories and telling them in different ways. So
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make is just that when you start to break apart the whole process into what its components are, sometimes, because we're involved in a sort of specific part of it, sometimes we see that as being lost. You know, it's sort of, well, how are we going to tell the story? You know, how are we going to use this visual? Whereas we're really sort of unique in that we're really after, you know, here's some data, here's a story that they say is in that data somewhere. Can we figure out a visual way of pulling that story out? And then, in terms of metrics, what we do is we give it back to the person who asked for it, but then we also throw it out to the public and say, do people respond to this? Do they react? If they do, we'll probably do it again and make it better. And then over years, we'll refine it to the point where it becomes actually really useful in all its content.
I can certainly emphasize that when we've created planetarium shows, sometimes we've brought in just the data that we don't know what it's going to look like when it's eventually visualized. For example, the scattering of objects out of the solar system. So we actually, because no one has visualized it like that before. And also when we think that the story is actually in the data and it's not. For example, we did a whale migration visualization, and it turns out that we wanted to talk about feeding, but it turns out we don't tag whales when they're feeding. We tag them when they're mating, so they're all down in the Southern Ocean. And by the time they eventually make it back up to the Northern Pacific where they're feeding, they've lost their tags. We don't know where they are, and so we couldn't actually tell the story we wanted to tell, even though we were told by the experts that this is the story we
Let me say one more context, just that sometimes what we do is we take a couple of steps back and say, okay, we cannot visualize the result. We can visualize the context. So for example, we might visualize the context of Kepler observations and then go on to something else to visualize the actual results.
So yeah, Mark?
Yeah, just real quick. I think this is a really interesting discussion. And to address the thing elephant in the room, I think this is about optimization of resources, because you say in your framework with the resources you have, you can't actually do those detailed high-end cinematographical storyboards going the whole full way. We can't even make storyboards on our side because we don't have the resources. And I think the discussion in those days that here, I want to understand what is the sweet spot? How much preparation, how much standardization, how much alignment of tools would be the optimal for us and for others, because it's clear we are all doing prototyping with different tools. We invent more or less ourselves and do fantastic stuff.
I'm not saying.
I got to do a priority interrupt quickly. I want to let everyone know we're going to do something incredibly disruptive once this discussion finishes. We're going to go down for the group photo, and then we'll come back up for lunch. So I just want to get people are starting to filter out. I just want to make sure you know we're going to do that. We'll be back up for lunch. And I'd say maybe like 5 more minutes of this, and then we'll go down to do that.
All right. And we had a question from
an online question. Many of us who are not near to a large planetarium have access to solariums, less regularly flew for use in our courses. When these systems were enhanced to use visualization, they often pasted an image into the sky without having a database with stars, etc., within the boundary of the image. Could there be an effort to provide high-end visualization 3D databases such as those presented by Joseph, provide these commonly used planetarium systems with better data?
You want to tackle that one?
Specific question.
Gaia in Stellarium.
Yeah. Well, is that what we're discussing tomorrow in the sharing of assets?
That's today.
That's today.
That's
Okay,
today.
great.
That's what we're discussing there today? Great.
I can make a comment about you want to tell a story, and a lot of people will just go out and find whatever assets available and use that as telling the story. I think I find that frustrating, especially when I see documentary shows on TV that they're using just any graphic that is related instead of the correct graphic that tells the proper story. And I just would love to hear stories of when you can say, all right, I got a deadline, I have to get it done by then, so I'm just going to use whatever we're trying to develop and then get out a new visualization that really tells the story you're looking for. I know that for planetariums, you have the time to do it, but it's a conflict we encounter often.
Well, some planetariums do, others don't. Jen,
Yeah, I had a slightly different comment question for everybody in the room. We've been focused a lot about storytelling, about what we know, content. How about storytelling about the process of how we know what we know?
Yeah.
It's a very, very hard thing to do. I just wanted to hear what people's experiences about how to do that successfully are in an engaging way, in the same way that we engage people and captivate their imaginations about what we know. I think it's very challenging.
I feel like what you just said is actually very powerful. We're a planetarium at a community college, so we try and make more of an educational emphasis than just the entertainment emphasis, especially with our school groups that come in and visit. And usually our teachers appreciate that you don't have to just gloss over everything. You can go a little bit in depth into how we know what you know, and I find that engages the students more.
Anyone else have something on that topic?
Yeah, I want to echo that and say that I think we've really started to shift the bulk focus of our content to talking more about how we know what we know and less about what we know, because what we know is everywhere, especially in astronomy, right? There's 100 astronomy blogs that are telling people who are interested in astronomy what NASA is finding. But the how we know it is a more nuanced question to try to answer, and I think helps diffuse a lot of the skepticism around things in science like climate change, or how do we really know the age of the solar system, the age of the universe. That's a how we know question, not what the answer is.
How have you made that shift? Is it just because there's demand for it, or it comes internally, and how do you change your process to do that?
The why we made the shift is mostly we just decided to do it. That we, without a lot of, I guess, evidence, sort of decided that was maybe a more fruitful path to go on. But the how, I think, is a lot of focusing more on the scientist and less on the science. Who are the people doing the work? What are they doing, and what do they look like?
Yeah.
And starting from there to tell our human stories rather than starting from the data and trying to inject a human element into it.
I'll just quickly mention a book that I really like that's related to this. It's called Ignorance, and it's by Stuart Firestein, who's a professor at Columbia who has a course on ignorance. He talks about how ignorance drives science, and he actually offers really interesting kind of storytelling kind of frameworks for how we can talk about how our ignorance is actually what pushes us toward scientific discovery. Carter, you have something?
I was just going to mention that in this discussion, it's very interesting to have Rick's keynote, which shows, the analog world of illustration, scientific report, and that we went to the digital realm. We end up with something like that. Video you hear it playing over and over. That's complicated, and belies a description to those who don't understand what these things are. And it's interesting that in the case of Carl Sagan's gifted ability to communicate with cosmos, that we're still doing the same thing. But it's also interesting that in the case of Space Telescope, taking these image planes, that if you don't have enough time to sort of do it right, terms, that do the 3D, is that this is complicated stuff, and so picking and choosing for a low budget, I won't mention some of the low budget pieces that are out there that are just picking and choosing stuff off the shelf. I think it is difficult to watch certain productions in that way, and it's very difficult to produce something that's highly curated and shows how we know what we know.
Maybe a last thought from Ken, and then I think we need to go, unfortunately.
Okay. More and more, because we're talking about school groups, you were bringing up earlier, more and more the stuff, and to tie in the how we know what we know thread, more and more the standards, both the Common Core and the next generation science standards, are focused on the process, arriving at the right answer, finding out how we know what we know. And more your teachers are forced to align your standards to your institution, you have to do it for them before they come to you. So that's going to be a very important thing, especially as it will continue to become more important as accountability in the classroom is anteed up yet again, at least in my school.